Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Over 1,000 days into this war in Ukraine, I keep coming back to this one question,
Mm.
and it's a little unnerving.
Wow.
Yeah, well, are we in Europe, but we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot with how we're handling this?
Interesting.
Today's deep dive is going to try to unpack that.
Yeah.
It's based on this opinion piece, really thought-provoking, and the title is kind of blunt. Is Europe its own worst enemy? How we might be fueling our insecurity,
Okay, getting right to the point.
right? And Europe's support for Ukraine is obviously critical. We all know that. But this article,
Yeah.
it digs into whether Europe's actions, if they always line up with the goal of helping Ukraine.
It's a really interesting premise. The author argues that Europe might be caught in these contradictions.
Exactly. And that's what I want to explore. Like the first thing that jumped out at me, this whole idea of Europe financing the war while condemning it.
It's a tough reality to confront.
Yeah, it's like, how's that even possible?
Well, unfortunately, it is. You see, while European nations are condemning the invasion and they're sending aid to Ukraine, many are still heavily reliant on Russian energy.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Oil, gas, the whole shebang.
we've talked about this before. It's
And this isn't new. Europe's dependence on Russia for energy, it goes back decades.
Yeah.
It's a complex historical and economic relationship.
Right, totally.
But, and this is key, it's given Russia leverage. Leverage that it's clearly using to its advantage in this conflict.
So essentially, every time a European country buys Russian oil or gas,
Yeah.
they're basically putting money directly right into the hands of, well, the aggressor.
It's a difficult truth, and the article goes even deeper, talking about these shadow fleets moving Russian fossil fuels through European waters.
Hold on, shadow fleets, that sounds like something out of a movie.
Right.
I mean, I have to admit, I'm not really sure how that even works.
Okay, so picture this. A complex network of ships, constantly shifting flags, changing ownership, anything to hide where they're really coming from.
Ah, so it's all about making it hard to track.
Exactly. And their goal is to move that Russian oil and gas under the radar.
To avoid sanctions.
You got it. It's a way for Russia to keep those profits flowing despite the international pressure.
Wow. Okay, and I'm guessing this isn't just some small-time operation.
No, not at all. We're talking about significant volumes of fuel.
So even if Europe tries to impose sanctions, these shadow fleets are making it way harder to actually cut off that flow of money to Russia.
It adds this whole other layer of complexity. And it really raises a crucial question, for everyone listening. Can Europe truly support Ukraine while this financial lifeline to Russia persists?
It's a real dilemma. It makes you think about the hidden costs of this war.
Yeah.
And not just in terms of money. The article goes on to talk about the billions Europe is spending on rebuilding Ukraine.
Right, which is desperately needed, of course.
Absolutely. But then it throws out this question. Could some of this devastation have been avoided? If Europe had maybe acted more decisively earlier on.
That's the author's argument, yeah. They suggest that maybe stronger military support for Ukraine right from the start.
Like giving them more offensive capabilities.
Exactly. That this might have actually deterred Russia or at least limited the scale of the invasion.
I mean, it's easy to look back and say, what if?
Right.
But it's tough to know for sure.
Predicting how a war will unfold is incredibly difficult.
For sure.
And there are definitely counter-arguments.
Yeah. What are those?
Well, some experts say that intervening early and aggressively could have backfired.
Oh, how so?
It might have escalated the conflict into something even more catastrophic.
So it's all about weighing the potential risks against the potential rewards.
Exactly. And those are incredibly tough calls to make in the heat of the moment.
No doubt. Okay, so then the article brings up those frozen Russian assets.
Ah, yeah.
Hundreds of billions just sitting there.
It's a lot of money.
To me, it seems obvious. Use that money to rebuild Ukraine.
It's tempting, isn't it?
But I'm guessing it's not that straightforward.
It's a legal and ethical minefield. Oh, in what way?
Well, for starters, who actually controls those assets? Who gets to decide how they're used? These are huge questions.
Yeah.
And there's no simple answer.
Right. Okay, this next part is where it gets really interesting for me.
Okay.
The opinion piece goes into this whole world of information warfare.
Right.
They say that Europe has been kind of slow on the uptake when it comes to recognizing and countering the flood of Russian propaganda, especially on social media.
It's a significant challenge, that's for sure.
And we've all seen how pervasive that stuff can be.
Absolutely. It can really distort people's perception of reality.
So have we all underestimated this aspect of the conflict?
I think there's a growing awareness that the battle for hearts and minds is just as important as the battle on the ground.
So it's not just about tanks and troops.
Not at all.
Hmm.
This disinformation campaign, it's designed to sow discord within Europe,
Yeah.
to erode public support for Ukraine, and ultimately to undermine democratic values.
So it's about creating chaos and confusion. Exactly, making people question what they see and hear.
It's pretty chilling when you think about how effective that can be.
And the article points out this worrying trend. Both social media platforms and governments have been slow to respond effectively.
They haven't really figured out how to deal with it.
Not completely, and this raises all these questions about censorship,
Yeah.
about freedom of speech, and about the responsibility of these tech giants to, shape public discourse in a responsible way.
We've all seen how quickly misinformation can spread online. It's like this whole other battlefront that we're only just starting to wrap our heads around.
And it requires a different set of tools and strategies.
Yeah, it's not like sending in more troops or tanks.
Not at all. And for our listeners, this brings up a crucial question. How do we navigate this world of information overload? How do we become more discerning about what we consume online? Developing critical thinking skills, media literacy, these have never been more crucial.
It's the challenge, for sure. Okay, so let's recap. We've got Europe trying to support Ukraine while still being dependent on Russia for energy.
Right.
We've got this debate about whether earlier intervention could have prevented some of the devastation.
Yeah.
We've got all these frozen assets with no easy answers on how to use them.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got this hidden war of disinformation raging online.
It's a complex landscape.
Where do we even go from here?
Well, that's a great question, and that's exactly where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, hooked.
We'll explore what the author sees as potential solutions to these challenges.
Right.
And, maybe more importantly, what all of this means for Europe's place in the world.
Can't wait. See you all next time.
Yeah, see you then.
Yeah.
All right, so last time we left off with Europe facing this tangled web of challenges.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
The good news is the opinion piece we're looking at, it doesn't just point out the problems, it offers some solutions too.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
And some of them are, well, let's just say they're pretty bold.
Lay it on me. What does the author propose? More than just buy Ukrainian stuff, right?
Oh yeah, way more than that. First off, they call for a complete, and I mean immediate, end to all energy ties with Russia.
Whoa, going cold turkey like that.
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't that like totally shock European economies?
It would definitely cause some short-term pain. There's no way around that.
Yeah.
But the author's point is the cost of doing nothing, of continuing to fund Russia's war machine, that's way worse in the long run.
Okay, I see, like a long-term versus short-term kind of thing.
Exactly. They're saying Europe has to prioritize energy independence, and that means investing heavily in renewables.
Wind, solar, all that.
Yep, anything that breaks this reliance on Russia.
It's a powerful argument for sure.
Yeah.
But is it realistic? I mean,
Yeah.
to expect European nations, especially those that are super dependent on Russian energy, to just flip a switch overnight.
It's a massive undertaking, no question.
It sounds almost impossible.
Logistically, it would be a huge challenge, but the author points to some historical examples, like the Marshall Plan after World War II.
Oh, right.
Europe showed then that it can come together and rebuild.
Okay, yeah, I see the parallel.
This is another one of those moments, they argue, where bold leadership and a willingness to share the burden are absolutely essential.
So it's not just about, like, finding a new gas supplier. It's about a fundamental change in how Europe thinks strategically.
You got it. And this ties into the author's next point, which is about those frozen Russian assets.
Hundreds of billions we talked about.
Exactly. They argue that this money should be used to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine.
I mean, ethically, that makes total sense to me.
Right.
It seems only fair that Russia foots the bill for the damage they've caused.
The author frames it as a matter of accountability.
Yeah.
Using these assets sends the message that aggression has a real price.
Like, actions have consequences.
Precisely. Of course, legally, it's not a simple process.
Yeah, there's got to be hurdles.
Questions about who owns what, where the jurisdiction lies, due process, all that.
Right.
But the author sees this as, like, a moral imperative.
To hold Russia responsible.
Exactly.
It would definitely be a powerful symbol for Ukraine, a kind of justice.
You know, bringing it back to that other battlefront we discussed, the one about disinformation,
Oh, right, yeah.
the author's got some strong opinions about that, too.
What do they say?
They believe Europe needs to be way more proactive in fighting back against Russian propaganda.
I mean, how, though?
Well, they argue it's not just about fact-checking or taking down fake news articles. It's about really understanding the strategies behind this stuff.
Yeah, the psychology of it.
Exactly. How they manipulate public opinion, it's sophisticated.
So then, how do we fight something that's so subtle and constantly changing?
The author calls for a multi-pronged approach. First, investing in media literacy education so people can be more savvy about the information they're consuming.
Arming people with the tools to think critically?
Yeah. Second, working with these social media platforms to come up with better ways to detect and counter propaganda without, totally stifling free speech.
It's a tricky balance.
For sure. And third, supporting independent media, the journalists who are out there providing accurate, unbiased reporting on the conflict.
Providing a counter-narrative, basically.
Exactly, because if we can't even agree on the basic facts, then having any kind of meaningful conversation about solutions becomes almost impossible.
Totally. That leads to what I think is maybe the author's most important point about European unity.
Yeah.
They argue that if Europe is divided, well, that makes it really vulnerable to Russia's tactics.
The old divide and conquer strategy.
Classic, but effective.
It's about exploiting differences, sowing distrust, creating wedges between allies.
It's happened time and time again throughout history.
The author's point is, European nations have to show a united front.
Yeah.
Not just in their support for Ukraine, but also in their commitment to defending democratic values.
So this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about something bigger.
They say it's about protecting the very soul of Europe.
That's powerful. It really makes you think about the bigger picture, the values that are at stake in this conflict.
It's not just about territory. It's about the kind of world we want to live in.
And speaking of, individuals, didn't the author have this kind of unusual suggestion for how people can support Ukraine?
You're talking about the buy Ukrainian products idea?
Yeah, that one threw me off a little.
It's definitely the most out there recommendation in the piece.
I mean, I get the sentiment, but does choosing one brand of coffee over another really make a difference in a war this big?
The author admits that the impact of individual consumer choices is limited,
Right.
but they see it as a symbolic gesture of solidarity.
Okay.
A way for people to feel connected to the cause, to show their support in a tangible way.
So it's more about sending a message than actually moving the needle economically.
I think that's the idea, but honestly, I'm not totally sold on it.
Yeah.
It feels a bit like maybe a distraction from the harder, more systemic changes that are needed.
I see what you mean. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this and wonder if our individual actions even matter.
It's a valid concern, and that's actually a perfect segue to the final part of our deep dive.
All right, bring it on.
We'll explore what this all means for the future, not just for Europe, but for the whole world.
Okay, I'm ready.
And we'll talk about how we can all navigate these uncertain times together.
Okay, so we've talked about Europe's energy dependence, the disinformation battle, and these big ideas for change. But where does all this leave us? What does it mean for the future?
That's the big question, isn't it? The author of the opinion piece really emphasizes that this war in Ukraine, it's a turning point for Europe.
Yeah.
A real crossroads that's going to shape its role in the world for, well, probably decades to come.
No pressure then.
Right. It's not just going to be business as usual.
So what are some of the ways this could all play out? What does the author see happening?
Well, one scenario is that Ukraine, with the West's help, manages to push back the invasion, retake their territory. And in that case, Europe might actually come out of this stronger, more unified, more willing to invest in its own defense, It could be this catalyst for deeper integration, a more assertive foreign policy.
Okay, that's the optimistic view, but I'm guessing it's not the only possibility.
You're right, it's not. Another possibility is that this drags on a stalemate where neither side can really win.
A war of attrition.
Exactly.
Right.
And that would probably lead to a heavily militarized Europe with everyone spending more on defense and this constant sense of insecurity hanging over everything.
So like a Cold War 2.0, but maybe even scarier?
It's not a pleasant thought. And then, of course, there's the worst-case scenario, a Russian victory.
Yeah.
Whether that's through outright conquest or some kind of negotiated settlement that favors Moscow.
I didn't even want to imagine that.
It's tough to contemplate, but...
What would that even mean for the balance of power, for democracy, for the whole rules-based international order we've been talking about?
The author argues it would embolden authoritarian regimes everywhere, undermine people's faith in democratic institutions, and it could very likely lead to even more conflicts down the line.
It's like taking a giant step backwards.
It would be a devastating blow to the idea of a Europe that's whole and free and at peace.
Okay, so a lot riding on how this conflict plays out. But
Yeah,
no matter what happens, it sounds like Europe's going to have to make some really tough choices.
for sure. It's a defining moment.
What kind of Europe do we want to see come out of all this?
That's the question every European citizen, every leader needs to be asking.
Oh.
Do we retreat, become isolationist? Do we just build up our militaries? Or is there another way, a path based on cooperation, diplomacy, a shared commitment to those democratic values?
It feels like the stakes couldn't be any higher.
They're incredibly high.
And it's easy to feel powerless.
Yeah.
Like what can any of us really do in the face of all this?
I get that. It can feel overwhelming. But the author makes this point about collective action, and I think it's really important.
Okay.
Every single one of us has a role to play.
In what way?
It could be staying informed, talking about these issues with each other, supporting organizations that are working for peace and justice, or even just refusing to be complacent.
So choosing hope over apathy, action over despair.
Yeah, exactly. Because this isn't just about Ukraine, it's about what kind of world we want to live in. And even though the future is uncertain, it's not set in stone.
You're right.
We can all contribute to shaping it.
That's a good note to end on. Thanks for diving deep with me today. A lot to ponder.
It's been my pleasure. And to everyone listening, we hope you'll keep exploring these issues, challenging your own assumptions, and talking about all this with each other. Because the future of Europe, and maybe even the world, depends on it.